The little bee first heard the phrase string theory in the same way he heard most modern revelations, half listening, with a mug of tea warming his palm, the Pacific fog pressing gently against the windows of his ocean house. A young physicist, one of those bright-eyed visitors who came hoping the little bee would bless his equations with Zen, had said it casually, as if mentioning a new brand of tea. "Not particles," the young man said. "Vibrations, tiny strings. The universe is music, really." The little bee smiled at that. Music, he understood. Later, alone, he sat cross-legged on the floor, not meditating so much as listening. The house creaked, the wind breathed, the waves waved, the world performed itself without effort. He wondered whether the physicists knew how close they were coming to something very old. He had spent his life insisting that the universe was not a thing but an event, a happening, a dance. Now these scientists were telling him that matter itself was rhythm, frequency, pattern. The electron was no longer a pebble but a note, the atom a chord. "Well," he murmured and hummed, "it took you long enough." Yet there was a tension in it that nagged him. Physics had once been reassuringly solid, billiard balls colliding in obedient lines. Now it sounded suspiciously mystical, and mysticism, when handled poorly, became another religion of control. The physicist had also mentioned entropy. "The universe is winding down," the young man said. "Disorder always increases." That was less musical. The little bee poured another cup of tea and considered the idea that everything was, at root, unraveling. Heat death, the slow fading of all structure into lukewarm sameness. It sounded like a cosmic version of the modern anxiety he had spent decades addressing, the fear that life was going nowhere, that effort was pointless. And yet, he chuckled softly, wasn't fear itself the mistake? Entropy, he thought, only looked like decay if you imagined the universe as a machine with a purpose. But what if it wasn't going anywhere? What if it was simply doing itself of itself? The way a fire burns or a wave breaks, the child that builds a sandcastle, knowing the tide will erase it, has joy, not in permanence, but in participation. The child who doesn't understand the tide will cry at his loss and believe the effort was meaningless. Still, something about entropy troubled him more deeply than he liked to admit. Buddhism spoke of impermanence, yes, but it also spoke of liberation from suffering. Entropy seemed indifferent, almost cruel. No awakening at the end, just thinning out. Silence, unless of course that wasn't the whole story. A few weeks later, another visitor came, this time with darker circles under his eyes and a voice sharpened by excitement. "The universe may be holographic," he said. The little bee raised an eyebrow. "You'll have to do better than that, my friend. We've been saying reality is an illusion for thousands of years." The physicist laughed. "Not an illusion, an encoding. Everything inside space is information stored on a boundary, like a three-dimensional image projected from a two-dimensional surface." The little bee felt something click, not intellectually but viscerally, like a familiar melody returning in a new key. "So," he said slowly, "what you're telling me is that the world is not made of things but of relationships." "Yes," the man said, "entanglement. Nothing exists independently. Every part contains information about the whole." The little bee closed his eyes. This, at last, sounded like home. He had spent years trying to explain to many audiences that the self was not a lonely ego trapped in a bag of skin, but a process inseparable from the world. The skin, he liked to say, was not a wall but a bridge. Now physics was saying something similar, though in the blunt language of mathematics. Quantum entanglement fascinated him the most. Two particles, once linked, remained connected regardless of distance. Change one, and the other responded instantly. Spooky action at a distance, Einstein had called it, with visible discomfort. The little bee grinned at the phrase. Spooky indeed, and also perfectly ordinary if you stopped insisting that the universe behave like a filing cabinet. Separation, he realized, was the real illusion. Not because everything melted into a bland oneness, but because the universe was more like a conversation than a collection. Each part only made sense in context. A word outside a sentence is nonsense. He began to see mankind's crisis in a new light. Modern humans, armed with powerful technologies and outdated myths, still imagined themselves as isolated agents in a hostile world. They spoke of conquering nature, of winning against entropy, of extracting meaning as if it were buried treasure. But if the universe was holographic, if every fragment reflected the whole, then harming the world was not a strategic error, but a misunderstanding of identity. You cannot poison the ocean without poisoning yourself, because the boundary between you and ocean is conceptual, not actual. Yet the little bee was not naive. He knew how easily such ideas could be twisted into spiritual complacency. If everything is one, people like to say, then nothing matters. He had always hated that conclusion. On the contrary, he thought, if everything is intimately connected, then everything matters enormously. Every action ripples, every cruelty echoes, every kindness reverberates through the web of entanglement. Entropy no longer seemed like an enemy, but a reminder. Forms dissolve, yes, but the dance continues. The information transforms. The universe forgets and remembers itself in the same motion. One evening, sitting by the water, the little bee imagined the universe as a great inhalation and exhalation. Order emerging, dissolving, re-emerging. Not a straight line toward doom, but a rhythm too vast for human impatience. Perhaps heat death was merely one movement in a symphony whose full score no one could see. What troubled him most was not the science, but humanity's response to it. He suspected that even with proof of entanglement, even with equations whispering non-duality, people would still cling to the myth of separation. The ego was a stubborn habit. It liked its walls. Science, he feared, might become another way of dominating reality rather than listening to it. Another story of control instead of participation. And yet, he smiled again. Stories evolve. Once the universe had been a machine. Now it was information. Next, perhaps it would be recognized as play. Not frivolous play, but the profound play of a cosmos delighting in its own expression.